Most Americans picture the start of World War II as boots on the sand, Allied troops storming the beaches of Normandy on the windy morning of D-Day. But what made that day possible? Chamber Divers tells the previously classified story of a group of scientists, men and women, several of whom were Jewish refugees, who conducted hundreds of life-threatening, permanently injurious experiments to figure out the underwater physiology necessary to make D-Day a success. And they did all the experiments on themselves. That is a description of Chamber Divers, the untold story of the D-Day scientists who changed special operations forever, by Rachel Lance, PhD. Rachel Lance has a PhD in biomedical engineering, which basically means using math and the equations of engineering to study the problems of medicine. She started her career as a civil servant for the U.S. Navy in Panama City, Florida, where she worked building custom diving equipment to meet the needs of military divers. Her scientific work has focused on the medical problems related to extreme environments, such as trauma following explosions, and the challenges of surviving underwater. She writes nonfiction about submarines. Her first book, In the Waves, tells the story of her quest to solve the mystery of the H.L. Hunley, a Civil War, you heard that right, American Civil War submarine. Welcome to Notes from a Ghost, a podcast about stories and the people who tell them. My name is Charlie, and I'm a ghostwriter. I love a good story. I hope you enjoy this one. Rachel, thank you for being here.
Hi, thanks for having me.
So before we got started, I apologized profusely because while I have a copy of your book right here and I've started it and I loved what I've read so far, I haven't had a chance to read the whole thing ahead of the call. And I hate doing that. But you had sort of an interesting take on that.
Yeah, honestly, I think that sometimes it makes for a better interview when people haven't read the book, or at least haven't read the whole book, because not everyone listening is going to have read the whole book. And so that sort of forces us to go into the background a little bit more. Like, what is the underlying premise? What is the problem these people were trying to solve? What did they see in warfare that they needed to address? And I think that can sometimes be a better introduction for the listener, too. Giving you absolution.
Oh, amazing. Yeah. I felt so guilty.
Don't worry about it. I firmly believe that books are meant to be enjoyed by people when they have the time and capacity to enjoy them. And, that varies for everybody based on what's in your life.
And I think sometimes books that have like really heavy, not that, I mean, yours reads like great nonfiction. But there's a lot of really interesting science in there. And I find that those books are great additions to like what Umberto Eco called the anti-library, where like there's value in the books you possess that you haven't read because you can still reference them, look things up in them, whatever.
Okay, now you're just trying to come up with an excuse never to finish. Come on, man.
No.
Yeah.
I'm hooked at this point.
Yeah, no, I'm good. I'm excited for you to get to the chapter about the D-Day landings, because just from a writing perspective, obviously this book ends with D-Day, right? As an American, I really wanted to write a story about that intermediate space in World War II. The histories we get are very much Pearl Harbor, December 7th, 1941, and then a miracle occurs, and we're at June 6th, 1944. In between there was military action, yes, especially in the Atlantic, but also huge amounts of preparation, like huge amounts of calling on the involved countries and their personnel for everybody to do what they could in whatever capacity they personally had. So this group of scientists is one group that kind of answered that call. They were just a bunch of lab nerds, right? Like most of them were already physically unsuited for combat. And they had this expertise in science. And so that's what they did. That's what they could contribute. And they stepped up. They hella stepped up. But the D-Day chapter at the end, of course, is the goal of all of that. The goal of that 3 years for everybody in all the Allied countries which was getting troops onto the sands of Normandy and then getting as many of them off as safely as possible. So that chapter to me is really personally important, because it's probably something that I think if I did the math, that chapter is something that I spent the most time on of anything I've ever written.
Oh,
So,
wow. Oh,
yeah, I'm really looking. Yeah, like the writing is not perfect. Obviously, like every writer, I would go back and I would change some and edit some of it. But our mutual point of contact, which is how I got introduced to your podcast, Russell Worth Parker, is a former Marine Raider. He's recently retired, and he gave me some of the best advice I've ever gotten writing when he read my prologue. So thankfully, I got it right at the beginning of starting this book. And he said, "Rachel, stop talking about ships like they're people." And I was like, "You're absolutely right. You're absolutely right." Yeah. And he was right. And I think people do that because it's easier. We know where the ships went. We don't necessarily know where each person went. But for D-Day, I tried so hard to take that advice to heart. And it is all the stories of individual people who were there, compiled together with their names and what happened to them. So I'm looking forward to you reading it.
Oh, I can't wait. And it's really cool. I can't wait to get to that chapter. I'm not there yet, but
yeah,
I,
it's at the end. It's at the end.
And I mean, Worth is, he's awesome, and he's coming on in a different episode, and I think we're going to have a follow-up, but he's almost like in the special operations of reading too. Like he's so good.
I know. Yeah. That's I think that we should designate that and then make a patch. I'm pretty into it.
Yeah, totally. If there was like 1% of the 1%, it's no, really, but it's true. And I mean, you look at a movie like Dunkirk, right, where he it's almost D-Day in reverse, and
right.
just super complex logistics that would take like a textbook to sort of spell out. But if you can find individual stories and link them together, and
I'm so glad you brought that up, which, of course, again, in case people haven't really watched the movie, it's evacuation of Dunkirk. So British troops trapped on the northern edge of France in 1940. The Germans at this point are in their major advance, and so they've kind of pinned them against the coast. So the British had this like huge heroic moment of using the tiny ships called the tiny ships of Dunkirk. They were all like civilian people that went over, brought these troops back. I love that movie so much for exactly that reason. And the other one is it has pretty accurate explosions. Like it's actually, for a Hollywood movie, the explosions are pretty good, right? Like they didn't go full Michael Bay. So it did exactly what you were talking about. It sucked me in to the individual people who made choices on that day in 1940. And they were maybe just random fishermen, or there's a teenage boy who became a fatality. They were like, this is what I have the capacity to do today.
Big day for the lifeboat.
Yeah. Oh, do you celebrate the anniversary?
Well, not here in Ireland, but I'm sure those stations do.
Okay.
In that part of the coast. Although a few stations up the coast from me, responded to the Lusitania. And that Eric Larson book. I mean, when he has the U-boat is kind of making its way around Ireland, and it's kind of on this date with destiny with the Lusitania.
Yeah.
All the places he's talking about, I mean, like I've kayaked around and been to, and like
it's awesome. That's
very,
awesome.
But weird when you go around the old head of Kinsale, you're cognizant that somewhere down there, a couple miles out, is that is
surreal
ocean liner.
That's good kayak. That was I those places with memory are so strange to visit. I recently I wrote this book during the pandemic, and so my ability to travel was obviously pretty limited. And I was thankfully able to work with a researcher in Scotland who was able to go to the library there once they opened up some restrictions. And then once some restrictions opened up a little bit more, I was able to go to the UK archives in London to do a lot of work. But my first opportunity to go to the D-Day beaches was actually this past summer. So,
Oh wow.
June of this year, which is 2024.
That's
You know,
it.
in
And
case
that's
this
the big
podcast lasts
anniversary.
for
That was
posterity. The 80th
it-
anniversary.
yeah.
I will say I deliberately made the choice to not go for that because I knew it would be overwhelming crowds. So I have heard that it was really cool in the sense that there were reenactors with period jeeps and things like that. And I think that would have been really impressive to see. But I personally wanted a little bit more of a quiet moment. That's just how I am. I really wanted to go and like kind of just be there for the stories that I had read about and the people that I had researched and have the time and the space to do that on my own, which turned out to be the right choice for me. And but it's very strange because you go there and it's still just like a beach town, right? Like Omaha Beach, there are people sunbathing on it, which is I get it. It's a lovely place if you're not being shot at, but it's weird to expect this like D-Day memorial moment, and then there are people in bikinis like playing catch with their dog. So there's this very much like contrast. So.
It's and a lot of it too, like, 80 years is not a long time in European history. And
Yeah.
like I remember my wife and I used to live in Strasbourg in Alsace, like on the French-German border.
Oh,
And
wow. Okay.
where I would go like trail running, like parts of the Maginot Line were like still there. Like there'd be bunkers and turrets. It's wild, like just
Yeah.
literally running through history. Now, you mentioned something that I want to get back to because I think people are going to find it interesting. I love nonfiction. I think that the facts are always so much richer. Like you can't outdo reality.
Yeah.
And so
History is crazier than fiction. If I tried to make up this story, I don't think anyone would believe it.
And I can remember like, as a kid watching war movies with my dad, people make these assumptions that everything's going to be like triggering or whatever, but it was more like the inaccuracies pissed him off to the point where he couldn't watch anymore. Even just,
oh, really?
Yeah. And he would just be like, that's not right. Like, that's not, or why are they yelling? Or like, these little things that are,
that's the better response to have, I guess. Like, it's way better than him being in a fetal position. So, yeah.
Yeah. Now, I mean, that said, I've seen that too, where he like, because he felt Saving Private Ryan got it right, but a little too, and he was in the Korean War for reference. So, but what you said about explosions is like exactly the kind of thing he would say. But he's not a scientist. Could you actually tell, like, what does Hollywood get wrong about explosions?
Okay, there are two things that Hollywood gets wrong all the time. The number one thing that I'm going to talk about is the easy one. This is the giant fireball. I think my favorite example of this is Rambo. Great movie, not knocking it. I see why they did it. But anytime you see this big roiling fireball, especially with these clouds of black smoke, what that typically means is you have an incomplete burn of your explosive material. So think about it. By definition, an explosion is a fire kicked into super high gear. Like TNT, all of your explosive types are literally just they're essentially campfire. They're wood that has its own oxygen attached to it so that it doesn't need oxygen from the air anymore. So even if you look at the structure of TNT, like you can Google the molecule, you don't need to know anything about chemistry. You'll see all of these oxygens all over it. And that is how explosives are designed, because now that oxygen, just like putting wind through a campfire, accelerates that burn. So your entire goal with an explosive is to get it to burn as quickly as possible and as efficiently as possible. Okay, so if you have visible fire, what does that mean? Not a trick question.
So then you're not dealing, I mean, that wouldn't even happen, right? Because you're not dealing with an explosive that actually...
Not with modern high explosives. They're too efficient. So you're going to see some degree of fire, especially if you get like a high-speed slow motion camera, right? There's always some inefficiency. But you're never going to see Rambo's giant burning
Like
waterfall
billowing. Yeah,
that'll
yeah.
billow for like 2 to 3 seconds afterwards. That's
Right,
the sign of
right.
an inefficient combustion process.
And
Yeah, and the same thing like with those huge clouds of black smoke, the black color, or anytime you see colors like red, that's a sign that there's been some contamination in the combustion process. And so that will happen a lot of times with things. The classic example is ammonium nitrate. If you look up the photos and the videos from the Beirut harbor,
I
or
was
the
gonna say
harbor
it's like the
explosion, right?
classic
They're like
car bomb.
super, yeah, exactly. You're going to see orange on a smaller scale. When it gets bigger, the light refraction makes it turn deep red. But you can use that to kind of identify what was in it because those are incomplete burns. Same thing with that deep pitch black smoke. That's something that hasn't burned completely. So typically what the Hollywood people are doing, and this is partly for safety reasons, so we cannot get too mad at them. They're almost always using black powder, which is a low explosive. It's not a high explosive. So it's going to burn a lot more slowly. It's going to produce your thick roiling clouds of dramatic smoke. And then they're going to pour gasoline all over it to slow it down even more. And so they're doing that for like the visual process of the drama, the Hollywood shot. So I'm not too mad about that one, but the real explosions, like the high explosives, they tend to be more of a rapid pop. So unless you have a high-speed camera, something like that, what you're really going to experience is kind of an underwhelming. I do think Dunkirk did a really good job of that. They were showing most of the after effects of those explosions, which at that time would have been TNT based. So people were adding things into their TNT to stretch it out. But it was pretty scarce. Even by 1940, even
It
by
seems like
1940, they're trying to conserve. But sorry, go ahead.
no, no. If I remember that movie correctly, it seems like people were getting knocked down versus like running away from the explosion, which seems to be
Yeah. So the other thing that I like about Dunkirk is they did not commit Hollywood sin number 2. So Hollywood sin number 2 is the big dramatic, everyone's getting thrown around and then getting up and walking away. The best scene for this sin is from the movie Swordfish with John Travolta. There's a scene with a hostage who's been outfitted against their will with essentially an S-Vest with a couple of bricks of C4 and some ball bearings. And I don't remember off the top of my head, but it's 3 or 4 bricks of C4 strapped to them. And not a big spoiler, you see it coming. It goes off. And it's throwing like a dozen people and 4 cars into the air from like these 3 bricks of C4. And it's this huge, dramatic, roiling fireball with just bodies flying everywhere. And a lot of these people who are flying are surviving. So this is Hollywood sin number 2, because in real life, if an explosion is strong enough and creates enough pressure to move a human body, then it is going to be fatal 100% of the time. So yeah, again, I don't think we discussed this, but my actual PhD work was in blast trauma. And so, I even got started with a lot of it with the story of Dunkirk, because there's so many blast cases, especially in the water, recorded from that. And that was one of the first incidents in World War II where the U.S. military was like, oh shit, we really need to study this more beyond just saying shell shock, put them in a hospital. So yeah, but even the trauma, like the physical trauma, well, shell shock, I don't want to gloss over the physical trauma of TBI, but no. So anyway, if the blast wave, or in the case of a high explosive, the shock wave, if the shock wave can move a person, that person is going to be dead 100% of the time. So in real life, you just see people kind of falling where they were. And I think Dunkirk did a good job of that. They like fell afterwards, indicating trauma sometimes, but they were not being blown all over by the blast.
interesting. And what
Yeah.
you're saying about those kind of leaps forward in our understanding of blast trauma kind of reminds me, and that's not something I know anything about, but one thing, and I was going to ask about later, that I have studied is like sea survival, particularly hypothermia. There's a great book, you may have read it. It's called I think it's the Essentials of Sea Survival, or the Elements of Sea Survival.
I
and
haven't. No.
and
I'll have
it's
to go look
by
it up now. Yeah.
oh, it's yeah, I mean, it's amazing, but basically it's
Yeah.
like, spoiler alert, unless you're in the tropics, the cause of death will be like
I bet there.
cold
Yeah.
and something else.
So you're saying it's a short book, Charlie?
right, right. And
Yeah.
I think it's like half the book is related to cold, and then there's stuff on thirst, there's stuff on nutrition. It's actually amazing how little water you need at sea in a survival
Interesting.
situation. It's not the mountains or the desert. The atmosphere doesn't take any moisture out of your body. Um, yeah, it's crazy.
That's
It's
really surprising,
crazy.
but kind of makes sense.
Like
So
I think it was something like 4 ounces a day. You're fine.
what?
Like now
That
you wouldn't be having
explains
a
so much
great
about the
time, but
USS
like
Indianapolis, though. Like, I've always wondered that. And I know people died because they were drinking salt water, but the rest of them were in the water for what feels like a lot longer should have been possible without a huge source of fresh water.
so they yeah, I
Interesting.
mean they most of the casualties there that weren't shark related, from what I understand, is
Yeah.
and that's one where I haven't read the actual like work, but um yeah, like there were, for example, I mean there were homicides in that, and
Yeah.
the darkest thing I read about the Indianapolis, and there's a great podcast about this too, but the sharks were a kind of convenient explanation for
Oof.
like they certainly a lot of people were killed by sharks, and everyone who died was eventually eaten by a shark apparently, but that was like the best case scenario. And then there were all sorts of other things that happened as a result of what happens to your brain when you don't have water and you're in the sun.
Yeah.
And it only
I
took, I mean, they were in the water for like what, 70 hours or something like that. It wasn't a
it
long
was
time.
something crazy. I would have to look it up. I'm not gonna lie. I don't know off the top of my head, but it was something that to me seemed like, oh wow, I'm surprised anyone survived. And
Um,
honestly, this is what you kind of just touched on is it may be not my place as someone who's not a veteran, but someone who studies trauma of veterans. One of the things that I do wish we could talk about more openly is the fact that the human brain and all of us have abnormal responses when we were in abnormal situations. And this is considered to be the crux of PTSD in general, right? Like it is your brain having a normal reaction in what is a hugely abnormal situation. Like every one of your survival instincts are now saying, be afraid of that trash on the side of the road.
huh.
You cannot over program those instincts when you just get on a plane and come back, right? Like it's a deeper part of our biology. And I think that it would be really nice to see more understanding of people having different types of behavior when they're in those extreme scenarios. Like this is something that I personally can in no way relate to. I've never been in the ocean for 3 days surrounded by man-eating sharks. Like I can't
Yes,
relate to that.
yes.
You tell me that that was what worked at the time. Like that was just the situation and the psychology that happened at the time. Like I feel like it's just my job to be supportive of that and non-judgmental.
Yeah,
So
and for anyone at home who feel, because I'm, I'm not a veteran either, and I'm definitely not someone who could ever understand what being in the sea with a bunch of sharks.
yeah.
Well, I while I have swum with sharks, it wasn't in the way that
Yeah,
those
it was a more
people did.
intentional version. Yeah,
Yes,
me too.
yes,
Me too.
yes.
Yeah, same. They weren't
And
actively trying to eat me. I had the option to leave. Yeah.
correct, yeah, yeah, and
Yeah.
but but no, I look to that as an example. I mean, first of all, I mean, I guess as soon as anybody ends up in a sea survival situation, um, whoever they were before that, I mean, it's kind of why there's a law of the
Yeah.
sea that you would rescue anyone who's in distress. That all of a sudden, that's not even a World War II story anymore. That's a timeless sea survival
That's
um,
yeah, exactly.
situation.
It's like The Martian. It's like
Yeah.
it's like we are all going to try and help. Like this is such a extreme
Yes,
scenario of humanity. Yeah, but
and
it's not yeah.
and
In general, that's I think that the fact that aspect is never talked about. I'm a at this point a naval historian as well as just by virtue of the books. I think I qualify, but like I've never heard of that aspect, and I'm assuming it's because it's kind of buried and considered shameful. And I just wish there was more openness
Yeah.
about.
So the two things, and I want to get back to the question I had about trauma, because it reminds me of something I read in this book about cold and how that was misunderstood for a long time. But
Yeah.
but the I mean, you can find some of the details. They're grisly, but the combination of like oil and salt created situations where people like their eyelids swelled to the point where they couldn't close them, and then they were just burned by the sun. But they think that a lot of the psychological stuff was I guess when you have like when you're that dehydrated, the the cells in your brain just start like
Oh, for
misfiring,
sure. For sure.
and
It's a
that's where we get.
completely different neurobiology. For sure. Yeah. It's no longer like the same choices that people would make on a living room couch well hydrated. This is not the same brain anymore.
Yeah, and
Yeah.
exactly, and I guess the way, because there's definitely a readership out there of like survival stories, and I definitely want to get into that. But that's one where like people try to compare these things, and like, but there kind of is no comparison. I mean, there are people who survived a night out in the open on Mount Everest in a storm. There are no stories of people in 60-degree water treading water overnight or what have you. It's
Yeah. I think
um
that's one of the interesting artifacts of water as well. I don't mean to brag because this is stupidity. This is not bravery, but I've had water-based hypothermia 3 times. And
oh
again,
yeah.
this is not bravery. I just really wanted to be diving in Lake Superior, and I was like too poor for the proper thermal equipment, and I did it anyway. But I wasn't saving anyone. So, but that was like July. It was
Mhm.
I was there in the summer, and I was getting hypothermia because the heat sapping strength of water is so powerful. Yeah, and I think that's one thing that's kind of interesting. When I was doing my doctorate work and I was looking at blast trauma for people in the ocean, which I had all these cases from Dunkirk of people who ended up in the water and then explosives went off underwater nearby. This was not only a really big wake up call in World War II. So again, like this story in Tabor Divers, you see these physicians and these specialists going, "Oh shit." Sorry, hopefully I can,
No, you can. Yeah, this
lights
is
are
explicit. Yeah, we're good.
so, oh shit, we don't understand this. And so not only do you have people who have just spent 6 to 8 hours in freezing cold water on the edge of death because of that alone, but they've also got severe abdominal pain that they don't totally understand because something went off in the water somewhere. It's completely unstudied at this point in the water. Obviously, explosives in air have been known for longer, but in the water, they don't know the distances that are safe. They don't really know how to treat this. There's no penicillin um, on a mass scale at that time. Like penicillin in terms of mass production was just ramping up. So abdominal surgery is incredibly risky still in 1940. And they are getting out of the water and like they just immediately become a science experiment by virtue of just happening to have been in that survival situation. Just like you're saying, this is not a thing that we could ever do to someone ethically on purpose. And so now, if you want to help save the next person, we need all the information from you that we can get before you die. So that's one of the really grim aspects of war that, as a scientist, like that makes me go through these case reports over and over and over again, which can be really emotionally hard. But that's part of why I wanted to start writing them too, because there's something really dehumanizing about taking that incident and then turning it into a number. Here's my case
Mm.
report 79, which I do have to do as a scientist. But as a person, I felt like there was so much more involved. And I'm thinking that's the same thing with you with like these survival stories. Like this is where I think we as writers get to add that life back in and explain where this information comes
Oh, that's beautifully put. Yeah, and
from.
I think absolutely, and even just addressing. I mean, you mentioned trauma in the psychological sense, and it's
Yeah.
interesting you see that now. In, for example, in this sea survival manual that is probably I think the most recent edition is probably over a decade old, but still they
Okay.
do get into that. What I thought was so funny is they recommend because post-traumatic stress and post-traumatic stress disorder are two different things, and they have
Yes.
opposite symptoms, which I thought was interesting. One could be like hyperarousal versus like catatonic, and
Well, okay,
or
so do you mind if we just break this down? Because this is something
yeah,
that's really, like, personally really important to me. There's a lot of stigma in communities about the application of the phrase PTSD and post-traumatic
mm,
stress disorder. From a medical perspective, when you apply the word disorder, literally all it doesn't mean you're a broken person. All that means is here is a thing that happened that is now taking control in ways that you do not want. It is literally just out of order. So
mm,
so when the difference between PTS and PTSD is if that post traumatic stress is causing changes or behaviors in your life that you personally are not okay with or that you find that you would want to change. On a basic level, obviously the medical people are going to be like, actually, this is the affirmative. Shut up.
yeah,
For a person,
actually,
this is functionally
yes,
what it
yes,
means. So it's not about stigma, but yes, PTSD. And so within those, everyone can have like their own rainbow of responses, but it's all about like what is okay for you as a person.
and
So
well, the thing that that I thought really jumped out at me in this book was they said, so obviously substance abuse is something to look out for in
yeah, for sure.
PTSD, like
Yeah.
long term, but they
Again,
said,
because it's an undesirable thing that most people don't want on purpose. Right.
yep.
Yeah.
And
So,
however, they said short term, like let's say you and your buddies just got rescued and you're back to where you can metabolize food normally.
yeah.
They're like, get drunk. They're like,
Nice. Go
they're
for
like,
it. No,
since the
do
dawn,
it.
yeah, they were like, since
Yeah.
the dawn of time, like that's how like sailors have dealt with near death experiences.
Amazing. Amazing.
And
One of the guys in the D-Day chapter, and this makes me feel like a terrible writer and person, but I'm blanking on his exact name because there are about 12 to 15 like people who I follow through the D-Day chapter. Like their names are all in there and their stories are these are from their histories, their records. Like I worked really hard, but I'm blanking on his specific name. But I remember including him because Edward Finley Garrett's, sorry, came to me. I remember including him because he was 24, which like at D-Day makes him like the old man.
mhm.
And he had been in World War II since the beginning. And one of his experiences, he had been on a ship that had been torpedoed. So he was in a sea survival story and he had kind of recounted how as the ship went down, obviously very common scenario with a ship that's been torpedoed, there's just oil and fuel everywhere on the surface. So by the time they're all fished out of the water, he survives that incident, obviously, because he makes it to the beaches at D-Day. They're coated in fuel. They're head to toe. He described it as blackened with the stuff. And he and
Mhm.
his other sailors are standing on the steps of some church after they've been fished out and they've freshly gotten to dry land. And these guys, covered in flammable material, their first instinct is all to light up cigarettes. Just like,
Unbelievable.
can you imagine if they'd survived this experience only to become human fireballs? Which thankfully they
Oh,
didn't. But like, yeah, that stress response is we don't have all of our normal brain cells firing the same way we would in a comfortable scenario at home. Yeah.
and I
So
thought even on the sea survival course that I was on, I mean, they emphasized a lot of like what seemed like kind of like, and this was taught by like a senior NCO in the Irish Navy, and it was open. You know, anyone could take this course. I took it through the lifeboat, but like, there was a lot of emotional stuff in there, like
yeah.
discussion of the need to give everyone a job in a life raft, even if it's a bullshit job. Like, you know, you're the one who
Yeah.
like bails out the water or and they have
That's
found that
amazing. I'm
it,
really glad that they're doing that. Like that's amazing because that's a huge part of the human experience. So
well, and they gave an example of there was a trawler that went down, captain died, and it was the first mate in one life raft and I think a chief engineer in another, and they went their separate, drifted apart. They were rescued after like a week. So it wasn't, no one was starving. No one was seriously, no one was harmed in any way. No one was cold. It was, I think, in the tropics. And the first mate, everybody like complained because he enforced discipline and basically ran it like a ship. And everyone, and then in the other one, it was anarchy and there were fights. Because in a raft, they had us sit in a raft for a while to just get used to how uncomfortable it is and how like if I move, you're going to get woken up. And the undisciplined raft, when they got rescued, they had to be carried out of the raft. There was nothing wrong with any of them, but they were physically incapacitated.
Really?
Because they had just broken psychologically after a few days. And then the other one was they were fine and they assisted in their own rescue and they didn't have any problems.
From a scientific perspective, like that is such an interesting case report. And like it's terrible that half the people had that experience, obviously. As a human being, you're like, oh my gosh. But now we have information to help the next one. So that's kind of my silver lining attitude for that kind of stuff. You have to maintain a little bit of optimism or it gets really bleak, which I'm sure you are. Yeah, with sea rescue stuff, you understand. Take the attitude of like, we're going to learn and we're going to get better. But yeah, that's what I hear from that story. So.
It seems to me too that a lot of these things, like people who do well in these environments, they have almost like an attitude of, first of all, resilience, but kind of curiosity about their environment. They, will be, and even sometimes people who maybe weren't very well adjusted to normal life, and this is their big chance to, like,
So as we discussed a little bit via email, I've recently gone through the diagnostic process for ADHD, and over that process, I've kind of become aware that. Like a lot of people, I had a deep misunderstanding of what that really was because the public conception of it is based on 7-year-old boys portrayed in the media as running around in circles.
Bart Simpson,
Yeah, that's not me. But I do have a lot of what I now know are the more accurate symptoms. And in retrospect, it makes so much more sense about my life. One of the things that I think is really fascinating is apparently ADHD people are particularly good in emergencies. And we may have like slightly disastrous areas of our life because things like making doctor's appointments are weirdly stressful. Like that's just, and I agree, that's the part of my brain that just misfires, man. I don't know why. But for some reason, in an emergency, it feels like a normal day to me. I'm like, okay, well, here's step one. And I've always been really good in those scenarios because to me, I'm just like used to living with a weird anxiety state of paranoia. So then when you get that huge adrenaline hit, I guess it's just normal for my brain chemistry. I don't know. So I'm wondering if maybe that's it. Like maybe now we go back through history and look at some of these people who have really risen in the moment and realize like this might be just neurodivergent people having their time to shine. Like, so,
right? Yeah. No, I mean there's no doubt in my mind that that's the case, and even just anecdotally, people I know who have been through really extreme stuff. I know like my relationship with the sea is definitely shaped by ADHD and kind of having a hard time on land. Yeah. And it's something we've covered in a couple episodes here. And it's so funny. I forgot to even include that in my questions for you, but I know we had talked about it. But for listeners at home, I feel like even the first 20 minutes of this podcast is like that collision of mutual hyperfixation where it's like like
ocean stuff. Let's talk about this. We are now info dumping. This is a 4-hour podcast episode. Yeah, no, I'm into this. I'm here for all of it. This is that. Yeah, that is how submarines and ocean survival kind of became my hyperfocus and my hyperfixation. I remember in the 2nd grade. I'm looping you back because I know this is one of the questions you wanted to ask because you sent this in advance. So I remember in the second grade, growing up as a kid, suburban Detroit, not really near water. My mom is very open. She has like a deep, deep primal terror of water. So we never even really were doing tons of boat stuff, even though that's common in Michigan. In the second grade, my teacher made us read something called John Goddard's Dream List. John Goddard was this guy who made a dream list of things that he thought sounded interesting when he was a kid. And he then spent his life trying to check those off. And they were cool stuff like climb Mount Everest, go parasailing, stuff like cool adventure things. And I remember that moment clearly as a 6 or 7 year old. And I remember that he had scuba dived the Great Barrier Reef on there. And I was like, even though that was a thing, that's it. And that was like the moment where the ocean clicked for me. And from there, that was my whole dream list. My whole dream list that I had to make for that exercise was places I wanted to scuba dive.
Oh,
So, yeah, I finally got the chance when I
cool.
was about 20 and I was in college. I had just finished my bachelor's degree and I was starting grad school the first time, but I ended up getting really sick. So I ended up leaving, taking a hiatus to deal with that. But at the time I was like, you know what? I've waited long enough. And I just didn't tell anyone. And I got on a plane. I went to California. I moved to an island and I started scuba diving.
Amazing.
And working at a hyperbaric chamber there. Which again, in retrospect, is like, oh yes, ADHD. Someone should have known.
Yep.
Things are clear in hindsight. And that was kind of how I got involved with undersea medicine, because that hyperbaric chamber was where I was staying. It was a free place to stay as long as I was volunteering, treating medical emergencies from diving. And they also had a massive library of undersea physiology books. And being the giant nerd that I am, every day I would take a book out to this cliff above the Pacific Ocean where I would just sit on my cliff and read textbooks about undersea physiology and sometimes, spit on the rich sailboat people. Were alone. Never hit anyone. I could not. They were farther away, but
Love it.
That was my intro. And from there, I was hooked. I literally didn't have a job lined up yet. I just started writing letters to U.S. Navy, especially in Panama City, where they do all their diving. Their centralized diving stuff is down in Panama City. And I just started writing letters, and I moved down there before I really fully had a job lined up. I was working at a dive shop across the street.
Nice.
I finally got my foot in the door and started building breathing apparatuses, which again, in retrospect, someone should have noticed the ADHD.
Yeah. I was going to say,
it worked out. It worked out.
If you suck at showing up to appointments, but you're really good with the intricacies of a scuba rig or whatever. Yeah,
exactly. I can take apart a rebreather blindfolded and reassemble it safely, but I cannot remember to get my car inspected for my registration renewal to save my life. So, yeah.
One funny thing I remember, because I was diagnosed with ADHD when I was 6 or something, and mine was the very hyper kind. And, but I've noticed I'm never late because I'm so conscious of my relationship with time, and I've always needed to have a watch. And where that weirdly, did you ever get into watches at all? Because I feel like that dovetails beautifully with diving because of.
I did.
Oh yeah.
Yeah, I did. I didn't get as into them. I think that's more of a male jewelry substitute some of the time.
Yes.
But I do have I still have my big honkin' original dive watch. That was actually the first thing I bought as a diver was a dive watch. Because, safety is important too. And so I was diving with it to keep track of my bottom times, things like that. And I do have a couple nice watches that I really love. Honestly, I'm 40 right now and I'm still going through the diagnostic process. And a lot of that is because I got really, really pushy about my mental health. Like I said, the D is on there, that disorder. There were parts where it was impacting my life in ways that were negative and that I felt like I needed to deal with, and wanted some attention dealing with. And so Yeah, it's been positively life-changing. It's been hugely positively life-changing to do that. But yeah, my relationship with time has been fraught. As you notice for this Zoom call, I have a system for everything. I
Yes.
logged into the call 30 minutes early, and because I was about to get distracted looking up a question someone had texted me about an aircraft carrier that got sunk in 1942. And so I pulled up the window first before I started going through archives. I now have 8 tabs open about this
Oh,
incident,
love it.
helping him find archival records to make sure that when you popped on the call, I was there. But yeah, that's actually kind of a fun story. This is one of my points of contact. I'm part of the French team, and the rest of them are all French researchers and divers from various backgrounds. And
Nice.
collectively, we've kind of been going through some of the archival records, looking for some of the French vessels that were lost during World War II and whose locations have never really been pinpointed. So that's what he was messaging about. Yeah,
So cool.
it's pretty
Um,
fun.
when I think of I mean, I was lucky enough I grew up between the west of Ireland and Cape Cod. So like
Oh,
plenty
isn't
of,
that the ocean?
yeah, but
Yeah.
yeah, well, oh, sorry,
Sorry,
s-
Tyler. Splitting
spending,
your time. I know. I figured it got there.
splitting my
Yeah,
time.
yeah,
Yes,
yeah,
yes.
yeah, yeah.
Um,
I knew
and,
what you meant, but I had to say it.
and when I was really, when I was really little, we spent a lot of time in Key West too.
Oh,
And my dad was always really into diving and sea swimming and all these things.
okay.
And he had a book, and I wish I could remember the name of it. And the other one, by the way, is The Essentials of Sea Survival. I looked it
Okay.
up. Um, but he had a book. It was like something out of a Wes Anderson movie. I think it was called like Scuba Diving and Skin Diving, or The Art of Scuba Diving. Like it was early, like Jacques Cousteau era. Um,
Yeah, I'm blanking on the title, but I already know what you're talking about. A classic in the field.
Imagine like a Navy dive manual, but illustrated for civilians or something. And
Okay.
it
Yeah.
like I just remember there were drawings of like basically don't attach fish you caught with a spear gun to your waist belt because they'll attract barracudas and sharks.
People
Like,
still do that all the time.
and like, um,
Yeah.
but I can remember like he taught me like to not rise faster than your bubbles. Like, and
Yeah.
and again, like he was really ADHD, and he would like,
It's genetic.
he would yell, and we would like practice these things. So like swim under, like deep underwater, and then like, okay, we're gonna come up, but like not faster than our bubbles. And
That's
um,
awesome. That's some great parenting because he knew that you were going to go do stupid things in life. And so he was training you to do them safely. Because I love hobbies that other people consider risky. Like you and I were talking about enjoying, you were enjoying your wave training and your extreme ocean survival training. And I was very jealous because I've watched videos of it and want to try it. Like, that's not the
best
reaction
thing
everyone
ever.
has. But that's great that your dad was like teaching you how to have those adventures safely. Yeah. What I thought was really interesting about this story to tie back when I was
Yeah,
researching this book, Chamber Divers, part of that involved going through every single record I could find from World War II related to undersea physiology, which was a huge, huge amount of records. Obviously, not all of it made it into the book, but one thing that cracked me up is how often they talked about sharks. So this is, yeah, like before they've been diving, people have been hard hat diving for a lot longer, right? So even in the 1800s, people were hard hat diving, classic men of honor, giant metal helmet, buddies up on a ship, pumping air down to you, doing that kind of bottom plotting. But World War II was when they really realized, like, we need to be able to do this without a surface ship because we need to start doing this as part of the method of warfare. So Jacques Cousteau and his buddies are in occupied France, not working for the Nazis, just being French in France while it's occupied. And they're in their garages and shops. They're inventing scuba at this same time. But because their country is occupied by the Nazis, they're not able to communicate with any of the rest of the allies. So that's happening in parallel, but separate. And the allies, especially the Brits, but also the Americans, I like to give more credit to the Brits because I do think they did like a more intense job of pursuing it are looking at ways for this diving to occur. And in these records, it is so funny how scared they are of sharks. Like, they put so much attention into like shark deterrent and how to repel a shark. And it's like, you can also tell as they're starting to experiment with their equipment in the ocean and they're starting to do this, that literally no one is seeing sharks. No one is seeing sharks this whole time. They're all just like talking about it constantly as their biggest fear. And I'm like, you should be more worried about the Nazis.
Or, I mean, what is it? Boyle's Law, right?
Yeah.
Of like, you know, the, which
Yeah. They were
I
aware
could,
of that. They were aware of that already. So they felt like they had that handled. But yeah, the shark paranoia was extreme.
that's so funny.
Yeah. Like,
and
even the knives, we now know, like, the classic giant knives. A lot of the knives from some of these first amphibious operators who, because of this World War II work, were able to do these first scouting landings, which is like the whole basis of this story in the book. A lot of the knives that they were carrying, they were like, yeah, this is just for sharks. It's like, no, really, you're gonna, I as someone in the 21st century, know that they're gonna encounter other things, but they at the time thought that was their biggest
like,
concern. Yeah.
it sounds like Dwight Schrute, like
Yeah.
the bears
Yeah.
are like the main,
Yeah.
main.
A little bit. I think it's easier to mock them in hindsight now that we know, like, sharks just really don't want to interact with people underwater. They're not interested. They leave. But yeah.
Now, one thing you and I spoke about before we got on is that just the ocean does not care, and it's
Yeah.
indifferent, and a lot. There's this quote, I don't remember it in full, but like described the hype about the danger of the sea as like a slander against our great green mother, and that basically most people who die at sea had something to do with their own demise, because the sea doesn't just kill people capriciously.
Yeah.
And like, obviously it's a dangerous environment, but the dangers are kind of known, and I'm wondering, like, there are so many ways the ocean can
Yeah.
kill you, and is there a way that in your research you've learned about a danger that most people don't know about that's kind of fascinating?
There's, like you said, this is a long list. I will say that diving and underwater survival. So I'm gonna approach this question in two different ways. So I'm gonna give you a more direct answer. The other one I'd like to start with is a little bit more abstract. I'm gonna answer your poem with a poem. So one of my favorite poems is The Ocean by Nathaniel Hawthorne. And that is a classic old poem about naval warfare. One of the things that talks about, there's a line in there about the fury on the waves and the peace beneath them, and what it's like to have that kind of peace once people have sunk beneath the ocean. That line is actually where the title of my first book, In the Waves, came from. It was originally titled Fury on the Waves. It got changed during the millions of marketing meetings that go into book release. But I still asked them to print a copy of that poem as one of the first intro pages, because that book to me, and this one as well, now that I've written a second one, are about something that I try to focus on in my career, which is that it's not necessarily that the ocean is trying to kill you. It's that the ocean just does not care. The ocean is so much bigger than us. And we are these arrogant little feeble land dwellers that have the hubris to think we can survive it somehow. And so this laundry list of ways that it can kill us are all of the ways that our meaty little bodies were not evolved to be in this environment in the first place. So, yeah, I don't necessarily have a favorite, but like, I don't even know that it's people making stupid mistakes. I think it's just like people die if they're not perfect. Imperfection is a human trait, and the second you're not perfect, the ocean is just going to roll right over you, and you're going to be part of that peace beneath the waves. Um,
Yes, I mean that's such a good way to put it. And even in like in the training for something like sea kayaking, so much of what I do is it's not about training to do it right. It's about training to not possibly do it wrong.
exactly. You
Um,
cannot make mistakes out there. There is a story in the book, which it's in kind of the middle, so you may have gotten to it. But as these groups are trying, and these are like independent war fighters, right? Mostly British at this time. Americans are doing their own thing, but the Brits are experimenting with kayaks. They're launching kayaks out of submarines as a way to scout beaches, and these are just like small independent people who are taking it on themselves. There's this one mission where some number of kayakers go out, and because their leaders had been trained in a bit of a rush for navigation, every single boat crew except for one dies in the Mediterranean. So it's warm. So
uh,
they're not in the, I mean, obviously the Mediterranean has its own challenges for sure, but they're not in the worst possible scenario yet. They're not in the North Atlantic yet. And this one kayak crew that makes it back, they're paddling for something like 300 miles. I fact check me on the number for sure, but it was something that was just absolutely insane. And that whole debacle changed the way they were approaching beaches because it really hammered home exactly what you're saying. One tiny navigation mistake, everybody dies. So, yeah, that's what I think is crazy about some of these stories, and especially during this time period, watching them evolve toward the final methods that they used to scout these beaches in Normandy prior to the landings and to send advance parties and to know what obstacles they were dealing with. Like this was the product of people who went out every single time, realizing that their story could be the mistake that teaches someone else about what in the ocean will kill you. And that's why my more direct answer to your question, answer number two, I still a second answer, um, is my doctoral work was on trauma from underwater explosions, which I still maintain is a really understudied field. But those stories, a lot of them came from World War II because they're case reports. And that was the big realization for me that a lot of people I think don't have. We imagine the explosion like we do in the movies. Traditionally, one of the major wounds of war is shrapnel or other flying objects. So we think about severed limbs and flesh wounds. But in the ocean, the water stops all of that. The water stops all of those projectiles very effectively. So you're no longer seeing any of that type of trauma pattern at all. It goes away. But because sound travels so far in the ocean, like how far away can you hear a whale singing? It's miles and miles, right? You can have trauma from an extremely tiny bomb to someone who thinks they're safe because they're so far away, just because of the efficiency with which the water transmits energy. So in my databases of this, I've got people with blast trauma from 2 miles away.
wow.
And yeah, that to me blew my mind when I found those reports. Like the 2 miles away, you may have, if you're 2 miles away from a nuclear bomb, you of course will still have radiation, but you won't have direct
Uh,
blast trauma from the actual explosion. So that was crazy to me. A new way for the
that's
ocean to kill you.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, and that's what
Yeah.
like even so that the book I mentioned was written after World War II because they were trying to figure out a lot of the science around cold exposure was commissioned because they couldn't figure out why otherwise healthy people were dying in lifeboats or after they had been rescued.
Right.
Um, and some of these things like the after drop, I forget what the scientific term for that is, but where your body temperature continues to fall. Um, and cold water shock was unknown until pretty recently, and because there were people who were dying on immersion in cold water like within seconds,
Oh,
and
really? Okay.
and people, if you've never been in cold water, and cold means colder than 20 degrees or like 70 degrees Fahrenheit, so not that cold.
Yeah.
Um,
Come on, man. You see that? I'm American. 20
yeah, but
degrees means I don't know what that number is.
yeah, I think
That's
don't quote me.
ice.
I want to say 68 Fahrenheit, 70 Fahrenheit, something like
Yeah. No,
that.
that's substantially cold. Like as a diver, that's that's pretty
Um,
cold. So
but
it's starting to get into the thoroughly chilly regions.
so
So yeah.
they used to think that like people were having heart attacks when they ended up in cold water, but what was
Yeah.
actually happening was it was a form of drowning, where somebody would gasp, and if there's water in front of your airway when you gasp, you'll
Okay.
inhale water and you'll die. And if you inhale enough water, it would actually weigh you down, and you would just go beneath the surface. And
So I've heard that with Arctic diving.
uh-huh.
So yeah, with Arctic diving, a lot of the weather, and I don't know the actual data on the safety analysis of this, but there is sort of tribal wisdom with Arctic diving that you shouldn't be wearing full face masks, because if you need to bail out and remove that mask, now you're getting hit in the face with a wall of cold water, and you may have that gas reflex. Now, again, like I would have to look up the actual research to see the degree to which that's true, but it's definitely like part of kind of the spoken wisdom of the communities because of that effect.
That makes a lot of sense. And also,
Yeah,
like if
it makes sense.
you're insulated enough, you shouldn't need your anything on your face. It's like that. There's a saying in a lot of outdoor pursuits where it's like if your fingers are cold, put a hat on.
Yeah.
Because like
yeah, as a Michigan girl, I've heard this story. I've heard this story.
yeah.
Yeah.
But yeah, no, I mean, but that's an example of like they did not know that basic fact about how cold works until very recently. And it sounds like what you're describing with blast trauma, that it's kind of new science and an old problem.
Yeah. But that's part of why I like these stories as a writer, because everything that we know about injuries and fatalities, just in general as people, not everything, but 99% of it can be traced back to a time that someone died.
Yes.
So that's how I find my stories. Personally, like I want to say, okay, how did we learn this? Because I guarantee you it was because someone died of it. And that was one of the things I thought was a little bit interesting and difficult to communicate in terms of science when the pandemic was happening, because people really wanted answers before the deaths occurred. And as someone who studies injury and trauma, I had this huge moment where I was like, oh my God, this is the nightmare scenario for communication, because I don't think people really understand that we won't know a lot of these answers until enough people have died for us to get that information. So I still remember when things first started coming out, if you went to the actual things that the CDC and the NIH were saying in America, and you were reading their actual text, it was very much written by scientists, which is a good and a bad thing. If you are a scientist, you understand where they're qualifying things. If you are not a scientist, it doesn't read as clearly. And so to me, that was like a nightmare communication scenario where they were like listing all of the possible ways a virus could theoretically transmit. And then those like qualifying words were getting completely lost. And everyone was like, it's not respiratory, masks don't work. And I was like, that's not what
they're saying. Yes.
They're saying we don't think so at this time, but we honestly just need people to die before we know, which is the horrifying way that it has to work sometimes. Just like with cold shock, like you cannot put a person in that experiment. So you just have to wait for it to happen on its own, which sucks.
Well, yeah, I mean, there's two things there that brings to mind. I mean, the book I'm working on now, which people can go back to past episodes, listen to the one with John Field if they want to learn about that. But it's with the 9/11 related illnesses from the dust. Yeah. And the latency there created all sorts of problems about when they were able to say definitively what common sense had already established, which is that this stuff wasn't good for you. And then also what scientists mean when they say that something is linked to cancer.
Yeah.
Because you can
Oh, are
always.
you including all of that?
Oh, yeah, yeah, yeah. Because
Oh,
so
amazing.
yeah,
Amazing.
and now.
Yeah, I'm really glad to hear that because that is hard. It's hard. Like, that's a hard thing to do.
So I have the book that's been kind of my go-to, and the people in the responders and survivors community call this like the Bible for understanding
Okay.
this topic. But it's Dust by Paul Leoy.
Okay. I have not read this.
And,
I'm
and
admitting my
he
own ignorance. Yeah.
and it's a science book, so a lot of people haven't because it's not like
Okay.
sexy nonfiction. But he was an NYU scientist who was doing the early studies of the dust. It it proves pretty conclusively that people knew the air was not safe well before the EPA and Giuliani said it was, in an effort to get everybody back to Wall Street and all these things. And the result is, more people now have died from dust exposure than were killed in
I
the
was not
attacks.
aware of that. I
Um,
cannot wait for your book to come out. That is going to
but
be a horrifying but really educational read, I'm sure. Like, that's, yeah. What
but
a story.
yesterday I was talking to a doctor for this book, and I asked him kind of what you're saying. I sort of reverse engineered that question, and I was like, I'm not a doctor,
Yeah.
I'm not a scientist. How do I talk about these things? And he's like, well, luckily, you don't have to be the one who weighs in on things. You can quote people who do know what they're talking about, and you can take the position of like the curious reader who probably also has the same questions you have.
Right.
And he said it's really complicated, and that he's dealt with people where when they environmental because now they have something called presumed causation around this
Yes.
9/11
Okay.
cancers, where it's like if you
Good.
were part of
Okay,
the
good.
cleanup
Yeah.
and you get cancer, there's no hemming and hawing that you were also a smoker or whatever. It's like the causation is presumed. But he said there have been people where they're like, oh, that's such a relief because I thought it was all the Diet Coke I was drinking. And he's like,
Yeah. So
we
this is
can't say that one way or another, really.
well, yes. Okay. Okay. So I have so many thoughts that are all coming at me at one
and
time.
and sorry
This
to hijack this.
ADHD.
I
No,
just
that's fine. No,
this
no,
is
no, no, no. I want to talk about this because I think you've hit on something that is really key and fundamental to science and science communication, which to me as a writer, that's what I'm doing. Like, my books are about letting people understand these phenomena that do affect their lives. And I think that that is so important. And that's actually why that was what made things click for me as a writer. My book, my first book, has an explanation of blast trauma in it. And when I wrote that chapter, there's a whole chapter, it was just a means to an end to tell this historical story. But a big part of that got excerpted in an article for Smithsonian Magazine. And
wow.
Harley, my inbox has never been flooded like that, ever, before or since. So this is February 2020. People are talking about other stuff when that came out. And my inbox was full of veterans saying, nobody has ever explained how this works to us before. And it's entirely possible that other people, it's probable other people are out there trying, right? But for whatever reason, this was the first one that all of these people emailing me had ever stumbled on. And that was such a moment for me. And I think that was the moment that made me a writer, because it made me realize I can do all the science I want inside my tiny little lab. But if I don't explain it to the people it affects, then it's not nearly as useful. And these people do deserve answers about their bodies. So, like, that part of science, I think, is so important as well. The one you touched on, where I have two different hats. My scientist hat, yes, I want a controlled experiment. I want to know what other factors there possibly are that could be confounding the statistics. It's not because I'm doubting you. It's because we need to separate out the factors in a careful way so that we understand this all properly. But person to person, if you're dealing with this as a human being, it matters so much less where it came from. You just deserve help. You deserve answers. And so those are, I think the best example I have is I was having a conversation with my brother. he was having a difficult week. His children both had some GI bug. That was not extreme, but obviously with young children, that's really difficult. And he was talking to me about probiotic yogurt. And he's also a scientist. And so we were having kind of a nerd to nerd about it. And he's like, do you think the probiotics even like reach the GI tract or even like bypass the hydrochloric acid in your stomach? Like, how much of this is even reaching the intestines? Both of us are doing literature searches where like there's no evidence that this actually ends up changing the bacteria in your intestinal tract. But at the same time, like, so as a scientist, that's what we want. We want those experiments. But as a person, he was saying to me, my children are sick. Here is a thing they will eat that does not make them sicker, that they are having a neutral response to that is getting calories in their body. So I was like, as a scientist, no, I don't think this has been proved. As a person, feed them so much of this. Like, just go for it. This is what you need as a person. Like, who cares what the reason is? You're getting a positive result, which is that your children are feeling better, whether that's just from eating or from probiotics. I don't really care. So, yeah,
Yes.
it's the two different hats. And so I'm really glad that you're providing that breakdown, because I think when people experience that for the first time, face to face with how science works, they think of it as really heartless. And it is, but that's because we have to overcome our instincts as human beings to do that. So they're the two halves. So I'm really glad you're doing that. I think that's going to be amazing to read.
Oh, I can't wait to share it with you. And it's, I mean, because
Yeah.
I like barely passed the math and science classes I had to take in high
Oh my
school.
gosh. If you
And
ever
so it's like,
yeah, if you want to talk
that
respiratory physiology, do you know what all extreme
mm,
environments have in common? The
is just
breathing kills you first.
breathing. Yes. And well,
So that's just like a majority of what you need to
yeah.
breathe. That's what'll
Well,
get you first. So
I mean,
yeah.
even, you
Yeah.
know, like even drowning, I didn't even realize this, like what is it called? A drowning event is literally if like water obstructs your airway.
Yes.
Now that's qualified by if you're someone who's like in the ocean recreationally,
Yes.
you'll be fine most of the time if you get dunked underwater or whatever. But yeah, it doesn't take much water to drown or
It
to
doesn't.
impair your lung function permanently.
And
Uh,
it's even worse. In autopsy cases, sometimes it's really hard to tell what the cause of death was because
mhm,
someone can drown without having substantial presence of water in their lungs.
totally. Yep.
Yeah, so if they're just having like that airway obstruction, you can have a drowning case where there's not necessarily water in the lungs, and then
Uh-huh.
it's just kind of it's frustratingly inconclusive. Like, this is a thing that gets talked about at underwater physiology conferences all the time. Yeah.
If yeah, it's one of the funniest pieces of advice I ever got before a trip was I was going to be out solo on some pretty long crossings, and like in
To
Ireland
clarify,
oftentimes
for
well
a kayak
yeah,
trip.
please.
Yeah, just
Yeah,
checking.
yeah.
Yeah, okay. Just
Yeah, kayaking.
yeah.
You
Yeah.
know, being a really long way offshore alone in a kayak can be very scary. And
Yeah, I'd
you know,
imagine.
kind of whatever happens out there, you have to deal with it. You can't resolve problems quickly if they develop or if the conditions change. And I was talking to someone who had been involved in kind of one of the most ambitious expeditions like ever in like a normal production model kayak, and he said you could drown in water that's a mile deep and you could drown in water that's an inch deep. So at the end of the
Yeah.
day, it doesn't really matter.
It
Like,
doesn't.
or sorry, he
It
put drown
he's so right.
slash, he wrote
Yeah.
drown slash be fine. Like,
Yeah.
so,
Yeah.
um,
Exactly. It's all about, yeah. Luck of the day. That's this is not my story, but I stole this from a book, and I'm blanking on which book, but it was one of the many diving books that I've read of people telling their diving exploration stories. And they were talking about one of their dive buddies. They had kind of a long trek in, and one of their dive buddies tripped, and he was wearing his double tanks on his back. So this is a substantial amount of gear. and he was sort of in a push-up position. He'd managed to catch himself, which is impressive strength already. But he was sort of then in a lowered push-up position above like a little tide pool. And they were all kind of laughing at him for this event happening because he was clearly not seriously injured, right? He had caught himself. But then they realized, like, if he lost strength under this 80 to 100 pounds of gear on his back, this guy was about to die in a tide pool. So they all then rushed over and helped him, picked him up. And I thought that was, first of all, the same thing that I would have done in this situation in terms of first mocking your friend once you realize they're not dramatically immediately injured. But then, having that clarity to realize like you're still going to drown, even if you're just trapped in an inch of waters.
It's
the ocean does not care.
No, and then with cold, I mean, like you said about us being just we're basically apes that are meant for a very narrow range of temperatures. Now
we're little princesses in the animal kingdom. Like the human body is just like we just evolved brains big enough to think of solutions to stuff, but we do not. Aside from our thumbs, we do not have a lot of other skills.
No. And kind of like the humility around science, and I want to qualify everything I'm saying that, I've learned what I know about sea survival in the context of being someone who doesn't want to die at sea and is very respectful of the danger, but also is a first responder in a maritime context, but with no real advanced, like where the lifeboat is, like we give people a ride to more advanced medical treatment. And
that's first of all, that's an oversimplification of what you do, because I think that's really funny when people do that. Like bad descriptions of your job. You just gave a bad description of your job. There is a lot more nuance to life saving in the open ocean, Charlie. But
I guess kind of like anything in the sciences, where the humility comes in, I guess, is we call it like big sick versus little sick. And the main thing I think you can do on the low end of first responding, where you're not a paramedic, you're not a doctor, you're not a nurse, is being able to quickly assess the difference between, is this person, do they just need a blanket, or are they like in very serious danger if they don't get to a hospital? And then if it is the latter, knowing that there's only going to be so much you can do, and you've got to then get that person on to, and then of course, like not making anything worse. And one place where I think you'd be interested in the science of it all, and you is hydrostatic pressure.
Oh,
and
mm-hmm.
Do you know about the Fastnet disaster in 1979? It was the largest peacetime search and rescue in history. And
tell me more.
So the Fastnet race, and people can look it up, but it rewrote sea survival and search and rescue. But basically, it was a yacht race from England back to England around the Fastnet Rock off the coast of Ireland. In 1979, they got the forecast wrong in a catastrophic way that led to yachts being out in a gale. Dozens of yachts capsized. I think 15 people died or something like that. But it was when they learned that you should recover a person horizontally, because someone who's really cold, the hydrostatic pressure of water around them. It's the same reason if any of you have had to pee as soon as you get in the ocean.
Yeah, you get blood shift, and then your body thinks that has too much liquid, right?
And because you basically, even at the surface, how much water pushes on your body on the surface? It's a lot. It's not like a lot, but it's like hundreds of pounds, a ton.
Well, so it depends on the depth, right? So it's a gradient. At the very surface level, you're at zero. You're at atmospheric pressure, meaning just the atmosphere of the ocean or the air that we breathe around us. But then it's every 33 feet of water is 14.7 psi. And I will give you that in metrics since you're in Ireland. Every 10 meters is going to be one additional atmosphere. So every 10 meters deep is one additional atmosphere that we breathe. And so it goes from zero and then to the bottom of the Mariana Trench. And so your feet are at whatever your immersion level is. So if you're up to your neck, and to subtract your neck, your height subtract the height of your head, and then the rest of your height is the immersion depth. And so you would look at the pressure at that depth beneath the surface.
So that's something that, again, because of lessons learned from that tragedy, like you said, lessons learned kind of through loss of life. We now train to recover people horizontally. I guess helicopter crews do the same. And that's basically so they don't lose consciousness as soon as they're on board.
Yeah, that makes total sense, because the reverse then happens. When you remove the pressurization from around the legs and lower body, they need to essentially refill with blood. So you now have that pressure is removed, those veins and that vasculature wants to refill. And so you're going to get blood drop from the other places you need it, like heart and lungs and brain, which if you've ever been swimming, it's been a super long time swimming, and then you get out of the water, especially if you've gone pee, like if you're in the ocean, we've all done it. Come on, we've all peed in the ocean. So like you've now lost fluids. And so when you get out, I know I felt really dizzy and lightheaded in that moment. That's exactly what's happening. It's that blood rush. So that makes total sense from a rescue. I would not have thought of it. But yeah, that makes total sense.
So there was something else, and I think if for people to really learn the history side of submarines, they're going to have to read your books. But there's one kind of current event.
This is why I don't know Fastnet. Most of the time, if I'm reading maritime disasters, it's like we can talk about every submarine disaster with
under the water
knowledge, but yeah, the above the surface ones are less my domain. So.
There's a good book on it. It's called Fastnet Force 10, and I forget his first name, but Ross Manier, and he was in it. With a name like that, you'd have to be a yacht sailor. But
your yachting cap is issued at birth.
Right. So there's a current event or recent event that I think touches on like sort of everything we've talked about. It was a maritime disaster. There was a lot around it related to science communication that I thought was really kind of annoying from even a moderately educated perspective. And I can't even imagine for you. And then the other thing is, it's a submarine story in pop culture. And I'm talking obviously about the Titan submersible, the kind of DIY sub. And it was amazing how all my like friends who fancy themselves geopolitics experts sort of became deep sea exploration experts like overnight on social media. And
that happens.
It seemed to me there's a phenomenon, before we even get into that, there is a phenomenon, and I wonder, is there a word for it in science, where people, it's almost like the curse of knowledge. They know like one little detail and they think that every thing that's even related to that is all the same. Like there's like all submarines are the same, or
yes, there is a curse of this. I don't know the name of the effect either, but it has been studied very rigorously, where if a person is an extreme expert in one area, they assume they have that same level of expertise in all areas. So if I'm really good at submarine stuff, then my tendency would be, well, obviously I know how to build a fence. I can do submarine stuff. To use myself as an example, I do try to realize my own shortcomings. I am an idiot in several other areas, at least several. But yes, as the example. But yes, that is a phenomenon that has been documented. And I personally think it explains a lot of what's broken in academia. But that's a whole other conversation.
Sure. Well, so I guess like what happened there, and what kind of insights can you lend to that maybe those of us who aren't experts in how pressure works and underwater. I mean, there was an element of an implosion.
Yeah.
that
So
happened.
that was a really interesting week for me because I was also, personal information, I was going through a pretty traumatic separation from my then husband that same week. And
No
so
way.
I was emotionally fully checked out. I was not reading the news. I was not on social media. I was just taking a hiatus from everything. And then my phone starts blowing up. And so I think by Tuesday, I had started getting submarine questions by Monday. And I honestly just thought it was my friends sending me submarine questions because that's a thing that happens to me. And I love it. I encourage this. I will give you my cell phone number, not on the podcast, but yeah. Um, so I didn't look into it any further. And then by Tuesday, my other writer friends were asking me. So one of my friends is John Ismay, and he's former Navy active duty. He was explosive ordnance disposal. And so he and I have our niche interests about World War II munitions. So we talk about that pretty regularly. And he was like, have you seen this? Are you keeping up with this? And I was like, oh, okay, now I need to Google. So Tuesday was the first time I realized what was really happening. And I start sending him messages about like, what kind of idiot built a deep sea submersible out of carbon fiber? Because I was thinking back to my time as an engineer with the Navy, and we were building mostly underwater breathing systems. But do you know what you need for underwater breathing systems? Pressurized tanks full of gas.
Mm-hmm.
So we would sometimes use those materials. Those are called laminated materials, things like carbon fiber and fiberglass, meaning they are built up in layers. And part of that layering process is what creates the strength. So we would sometimes use those materials for pressurized tanks. But there are two really important things to know about that. First of all, in that case, the pressure is coming from inside the house, pushing outward.
Like
right?
a airplane. Like there's carbon fiber airplanes.
Exactly. You can pull on rope all day. I'm not going to make the joke, but they are literally, when you're using it for a vessel where there's pressure from the outside, they're literally pushing on a rope. Because that's what carbon.
I've never heard it
yes,
put that way, but like structurally, that's what's happening.
Structurally, that's what's occurring because
Wow.
both carbon fiber and fiberglass, these are strings. It's carbon. It's literally a fiber made out of carbon molecules. So it is literally a molecular rope, and they are pushing a rope. Listeners can make their own dirty jokes from that. But so immediately, that's warning point number one. I was like, this is not a material that's suitable for external pressurization in this fashion, especially. And then when you are also using these materials, these laminated materials in the ocean repeatedly, they break down a lot faster than they do in air. So the official term for this is galvanic current. So this is the same idea as why you don't want to put steel next to aluminum. So anyone who's ever mixed metals or heard they shouldn't mix metals and throw it in the ocean, it's because salt water is a really good conductor. Same thing for lightning. It'll move those electrons around and it'll transfer them from one material to the other. It will essentially make a little battery, which is wild and awesome. But with these laminated materials like carbon fiber and fiberglass, they are built up in their strength by doing alternating layers of the material itself and then epoxy glue. So material glue, material glue, material glue, like a croissant. And that layering in itself can have a galvanic current. So just the idea alone, you put it in salt water, you've created a battery out of this material, and it starts to break down the epoxy. So the epoxy part is part of the strength. You need that layer. It is part of how this material works. So when you are not only doing this, you are now pushing on a rope where you have broken down over time the material that has given that rope any kind of actual solid form. Carbon fiber in raw form is actually like a fabric. It's the epoxy that makes it a solid. So now you can see what's happening as they're putting this thing in the ocean over and over again. And that's not good. So even when we would use these types of laminated materials for tanks, invariably, in my experience for the things that we were designing, we would retest them. We would go through full functional safety testing every 3 years, which if you're a scuba diver, is more often than a standard tank. That our standard tank is every 5 years. So because of the way this works, this galvanic current, we would do it every 3 years. And invariably, they would all break by year 9. So that was the max life you could expect, at least in our context. So for me, that I was looking at, I had never heard of this submersible before, but I was immediately texting this guy like, what the hell engineer green-lighted this choice? And he immediately was like, oh my God, nobody's talking about that at all. Can you give a quote? And I was like, oh shit. So from there, it spiraled out of control. So I was literally, my soon-to-be ex-husband is moving out. I'm coming back from a scientific conference that I cannot cancel because I have students presenting there. So I literally am required to go. Cannot cancel from the personal issue. So I'm talking to the New York Times as I am physically running through an airport. And they were like kind enough to edit the gasps out. I was literally like about to be late for my flight because the security is a disaster. I'm running. And so from there, and apparently people hadn't really talked about it before. So from there, it was just like bananas, people just wanting me to say the same thing about the carbon fiber over again. But yes, if you are going to build your ocean structures out of aluminum material like carbon fiber or fiberglass, you need to be very aware that there will be galvanic corrosion occurring, and that needs to be part of your functional analysis. And if you are taking this somewhere super deep, don't push on a rope, man. So yeah, for me, unfortunately, that became a little bit of a balancing act because, in my opinion, this was a 0% chance of survival vessel. Once you had an incident in this vessel, I could not, as an engineer, see a way that would be survivable. And we were still in that search period, and like CNN was asking for like talking head stuff, and they were like, "What do you think about this search? Like, should the families have hope?" And I was then in this position of being like, and I had to be honest, and I was trying to be as tactful and kind and humane as possible. But I had to be honest. That was meanwhile, my husband's carrying his shit out of the house in the background. So that was just it was just a weird week. But I felt a lot of as a human being, I felt socially obligated to speak out against what this company had done. Because in my opinion, that was gross negligence. And I thought that was really irresponsible. And then on the top of it, something I've still never gotten resolution for. You do marine survival stuff, right? Like, how big these rescue operations are. The company gave this notice of 96 hours estimated survival time. And they were, first of all, you should question anyone that gives you an even multiple of 24 hours. Where does this number come from?
Yeah, day
anytime
4,
there's
your time is up.
24 hours, you have to question it. But then second of all, they were saying this is the amount of oxygen they have on board. As a survival person, extreme environment person, anytime someone says that oxygen is the limiting factor, I get all the red flags. And my alarm, every single alarm bell goes off. These people don't know what they're talking about. So I still have not to this day been able to find any evidence that they had an actual system on there to process the breathing gas inside the vessel, because what actually kills you is the carbon dioxide.
Yep. Well, same with free dive, right? It's not a lack of oxygen, it's a saturation of carbon dioxide.
Right. So by my math, they had at most 12 to 14 hours. I think they wasted the time and the hope of the world. And I don't have necessarily proof on that. I don't have insider documentation, but that is my opinion based on what I have. Yeah. And I think all of those rescue attempts were resources that I personally would have liked to have seen diverted elsewhere because of the way this company had mismanaged the design.
Well, I love that about even multiples of 24 hours. That's a factor in John's book in a way that I won't get into here because people are going to have to read it, but it was consequential. Again, because that sounds nice to say 96 hours or
Yeah.
whatever. But no, I mean, and the other thing too, because I remember the only scenarios that I could relate to out of any knowledge or experience or whatever would it be in anything that had it coming to the surface. And
Uh-huh.
something people pointed out, like a best case scenario
Uh-huh.
where she were to surface, the hatch is like what, the size of probably like a basketball or something, or a little bigger. Good luck finding that out
Yeah.
in the North Atlantic, maybe in breaking
Yeah.
seas. Maybe there's no reception for whatever tracking they had or didn't have. I mean, like these are
That's a
things.
really good point. Yeah, that's and also like it was a mixture of black and silver, which it's like, do you know what wave chop looks like? Pretty
Yeah,
much that. Like so
no,
yeah.
forget it. No, there's like that's not, it's not a thing. And
Right.
even
Right.
and I think too, like when you look at the origins of weird conspiracy theories and alternate takes and whatever, like that Malaysian Airlines flight that went down, I think there's a sense of entitlement that's a side effect of like technology and modernity, where
Yes.
we don't expect these systems to fail. And when they do, we assume there's some system, like we know where all the planes are, surely. It's like, well,
Yes.
once you're a certain distance from land, the answer is not really.
Yes.
Um, you know,
Yes.
and it's still I mean, the wilderness is defined as 90 minutes from in a first responder sense. Wilderness means you're 90 minutes or more from a advanced medical care.
Oh, okay.
In Ireland, that means you've put your big toe in the water on a beach. Like,
Mhm.
you're in the wilderness. Um,
Yeah. Yeah. That's Ireland is one of my major hiking goals, by the way. But
oh, it's great. It's
yeah.
great. Um,
Yeah, it looks absolutely stunning. No, I totally understand, and people have this occurs with diving in the world of diving. There's a world of there's an organization that I'm sure you're familiar with, Divers Alert Network. As a diver, Dan, abbreviated Dan, and they started out of the research department in diving physiology at Duke University, which is where I was a scientist until recently, and they now are a separate organization, but they're a nonprofit who provides supplemental health insurance for divers because a lot of diving accidents are not covered by regular health insurance. And these are some of the best people ever. Like, I'm very thankful that they like invite me to their business dinners and stuff just because they are all divers who genuinely care about rescuing other divers in need. And the money that's left over from people's insurance payments goes to diving physiology research.
oh,
And
love
like,
that.
yeah, and they have physicians, like qualified physicians and first responders 24/7, which I think is a phrase that's overused, but in this case, it's actually true. They're there all the time and you can call them for free anytime and get advice. And if you have their insurance too, like they will arrange your rescue. They are the ones sending the helicopters. Like they have those networks and they know it because so many people get into that exact situation where they don't necessarily have their rescue plan. They don't realize, like, off the coast of Bali, you may not have access to the standard of medical care that you would expect if you were on a beach in Southern California. And it's crazy. But yeah, organizing those logistics are
Oh,
insane.
I was gonna say, like, yeah, it's all fun and games getting your GoPro footage until you have to be repatriated from the Maldives with the bends. Like,
Yeah.
you know,
Yeah. With a special low flying helicopter. Like, yeah.
oh,
But they actually, they pay for like they're the only insurance company I've ever encountered that pays the bills for that. Like, so yeah.
um,
Yeah, I wish it was for other things too. So
my wife is Swiss, and part of her just basic insurance apparently covers like search and rescue and all sorts of things that, because I
really?
think you kind of have to have that in the Alps, like to like
Yeah, that makes
um
sense.
and then you I guess they just naturally extend it to if you had to be flown home for medical reasons or whatever.
Oh
Um,
wow. Yeah. My my
I,
my partner is a French diving researcher and
oh, cool.
he keeps offering to try and put me on his French national healthcare plan because France is more open about like non-married relationships. I went through a lot of trauma with my divorce, and I don't necessarily know that marriage is right for me personally again. But I do, love him very much, and we're in a committed relationship. But he's so terrified by American healthcare. He keeps trying to like put me on French healthcare. I'm just like, listen, one step at a time, man. One step at a time. But yeah, he keeps saying the same thing of like, they'll do this. Like, that doesn't even make sense to me as an American.
They have a lot of they have a lot of like doctors who'll make house calls. That's kind of the standard way they and I had to get a shot when I was there, and I wasn't in their system because we were there kind of on an extended stay. It wasn't like we weren't like residents. And I called a doctor, and she asked for my national health whatever number, and I didn't have one. And she's like, well, you're gonna like I'm gonna have to charge you that, and are you okay with that? And I was like, well, how much is it? She's like, €16, which is what, $18.
Yeah.
But then I was told like no French person would be okay with paying even that. Like they'd be like, But so I wanna.
That's he just came back from Bonnier, and some of the from a diving research conference in Bonnier, and he said one of the Americans went and just like bought a whole bunch of stuff. Like he went and he had a prescription for something, and he like got all of his prescriptions, and then all of the other Americans went and got all of their prescriptions refilled too while they were in Bonnier, because he came back and he was like, it's only $70 here. Yeah, and my partner was like, that's an insane amount of money. People really pay that? I was like, that's really cheap for us. So, yeah.
Oh, man. Yeah, that's a whole separate podcast. And definitely, again, I hate to like, I won't even get into how that relates to the book that I'm working on, but obviously that was a factor. Where
I mean, I can, especially if you have something like that where it's a first responder in not globally a new scenario, like the falling of buildings has happened before, but this specific scenario with the building construction material, the scope of the exposure that they experienced, the length of time that they experienced, this is a new medical incident in that sense. And so I can see how you would have the insurance companies trying to abuse the standards of science and say, no, we need to wait and see how many people get cancer and then compare it to controlled match population groups and blah, blah, blah. And it's like, this person still needs care in the meantime. Keep your data, collect your data, but this person still needs care. So,
totally. Yeah. And the main factor too is that there's, I think every congressional district, but like 2 have someone who went to the ground zero.
Oh, really?
So it's a nationwide thing, and that gets into the complexities of like how each state handles things differently for healthcare.
Oh, wow.
Now, I wanted to ask a couple of reading questions before we wrap up, because
yeah, we've been talking for a while, which I've enjoyed, but yeah, I don't know if it's going to make it.
I want to respect your time.
Still with us, thank you for your. Please pursue an ADHD diagnosis for yourself.
No, I know. But no, listen, I knew this was going to be a long one, because I knew just if it's like I told Worth, I was like, yeah, I most certainly could fill some time with submarine questions. And
when he suggested it and I looked at your podcast catalog, I was like, oh yeah, we're gonna have fun. So,
what's the line from the SpongeBob song? It's like nautical nonsense.
Yeah.
So, if you had to recommend a book to listeners that could potentially save their life, what would it be?
One of my all-time favorite books is Into Thin Air, which I'm sure you've probably, that's one of my all-time favorite books. I've read it over and over again. I think he does 2 things. I mean, he does multiple things masterfully in that book. The 2 things that I focus on the most as a reader are, number one, he describes these extreme scenarios without melodrama. He gives everything super matter of fact, And that makes it come across as the perspective of the person in the situation struggling to stay alive. Which, in my opinion, makes the narrative so much more terrifying than if he had filled it with flowery adjectives. So I think that to me is a lesson that I try to take as a writer about how to communicate the way people are actually thinking in extreme scenarios. So I love that about that book. And the second part is, I think for the same reasons, he's really non-judgmental about the mistakes people made in a good way, where he presents them not as this person was an idiot. He presents them as, here were the choices we all were faced with. People made different choices for different reasons that in retrospect, we know are the wrong choices. But you don't know that yet. As you go through the book, everything seems most of the choices seem pretty reasonable, and then they just have differing outcomes. So I think that that's like a really big lessons book too, about not only the proper choices and why, but also what it can feel like to be presented with a wrong choice that still kind of makes sense.
And it, something I was told on an incident management course for sea kayaking is that, like, incidents are messy. So there isn't, the solutions are often messy. And so there isn't a perfect way to do it. And sometimes when these things are taught, you have people going into this student mode where they want to tick boxes, they want to do it the right way. But, you could look at so many, so many survival stories are people who got out of a mess that they got themselves into. Elegantly.
Yeah, for sure. But I just, as a person, I get myself into 70,000 messes a day, right? It's just, I'm lucky enough that the one more thing didn't happen that would have turned it into a catastrophe. And I think that that's a universal truth. We're all one thing away from catastrophe at some points in our lives. And those stories, the survival stories or the catastrophe stories, are just the people that had that one extra thing that happened when things were already messy. So,
yes.
Yeah.
No, that's a good one. That was one of those pieces of nonfiction that like simultaneously made me want to have adventures, but also made me want to write books.
Also made me want to stay home. It's like both. Like, I want to have an adventure, but not this one. Like,
Well, it's funny if you hear him talk in interviews, and he doesn't give a lot of interviews, but he's like, I just like wish I hadn't gone on that stupid trip. Like, he doesn't. He's totally dismissive, not of the book, but of he saw it as a really pointless loss of life, and it obviously haunts him.
That makes total sense in his writing style too, because that explains why he's non-flowery. Like, he's very direct about what's going on, and he's just narrating this experience. And that to me came like that. It's not lack of emotion, but that like depression of emotion, the depression combined with the need for survival, like that was the feeling that I think comes across in that book and so well. So yeah. That's interesting. I've not heard him speak. Yeah.
He's it's sort of exactly what you'd expect. Like, he's every bit as good as his writing. We
gotta hate those writers a little bit, right? Like, it's just a little bit.
Yeah. Well, I feel like I do this thing where I try to edit while I'm talking. I probably do it a lot on here, where it's that, like, in real time. And when you're doing it in writing, you get to do that. You get to unwrite what you just wrote and write it better. But in sentences, you have no choice but to sort of meander and repeat yourself. And
you're committed.
Apologies to anyone who's still listening, obviously.
But I do think that being a writer has made me better at speaking, because it's made me more careful in the way I put together a sentence. But yeah, it is for sure. It's for sure a skill set.
There's one book, is kind of adjacent. I feel like these books they're on all the same reading lists and everything. That and anyone who had anything to do with this story would be open invitation stands on this podcast, but Alive. Um,
Oh, yes. I'm
th-
obsessed with that story.
it's amazing. I've
Yeah.
and there and by the way, there's a podcast, the same one that did the episode on the Indianapolis, did a trilogy on that one, and they were
Oh, really?
comparing. It was between
Give him a plug, man. What's the name?
last podcast on the left,
Oh, okay.
and,
I've heard of it. Okay.
and
Yeah.
they did they also did one on the Donner Party, and it was between those
Okay.
three of like which was the worst one, and
Those I think are the three examples that I think of the most often when I'm just like, you really just can't judge because you were not there. And yes, there are other incidents where people did really stupid shit and deserve some judgment. Like, I'm not saying this is a blanket rule for every scenario, but yeah, there those types of extreme situations. It's like you just don't know.
right, and I think one of those survivors pointed that out, where he's like, you don't know, and he's like, and,
Yeah.
and we didn't either, and I think what's really interesting about that one is you're dealing with people who have absolutely no experience or training or knowledge,
Yeah.
beyond, they had a couple, medical students. So it's like, okay,
Yeah.
you're
And
now the doctor. Like
crushed it.
they crushed
Like
it.
they crushed it.
And
Yeah.
this sounds really callous, but I think, it's kind of it sounds like just almost the ultimate wilderness first aid scenario, because there were, so many injured people and such limited supplies. And yeah, I mean, they did really well. It's also kind of a backhanded warning to the sea, because like they survived in street clothes for 3 months in
Yeah.
the mountains.
If you want to see undersea survival story of things going wrong, one book that I think is really well done is Shadow Divers by Robert Kurson. It's very popular, so it's really well known. But this is a diving survival story. Not in the sense where they're trapped. They're not really trapped down there, but Kurson does a beautiful job as a writer of establishing what the risks are of this level of diving by presenting you with accidents intermittently through the book, in ways that you don't necessarily see coming. So he builds this suspense that's very realistic to what it's like when you're entering into a hazardous environment, where you now become slowly aware of the various things that can kill you in this environment. And you're running your mental checklist as you're reading. Like, what is this diver doing? Is he about to die? So I think Shadow Divers, that one, he does a really good job of the same thing for underwater.
There was a surprisingly good movie a few years ago about the Kursk. I don't know if you saw it, but
I haven't seen it, but I'm very familiar with the accident. Yeah.
I mean, it seems like they stretched out events that happened very quickly, like in order to have like character development happening during a
Yeah. Sometimes I struggle with those types of movies for maybe the same reasons as your dad, like less directly, obviously, but either I'll be taken out of it by inaccuracies and I'll be like, this is not okay on an inaccuracy level, or like I'll have read every single autopsy report from that incident, which is a thing that happens a lot when we're talking. Like I've looked up all of these reports and read the original works and the no punches pulled medical reports of what was going on. And so sometimes then seeing that represented in a fictionalized way can be a little bit difficult for me. Even though I wasn't there, obviously, but when you kind of spend a lot of time immersed in the real story, it can be a little bit difficult.
I've had that happen with research, where you know how someone met their end in a way where you then, it's weird. It's kind of like this,
I'm sure you'll never look at 9/11 again after writing this book, or the same way. I didn't.
No, yeah.
I messed up that sentence, but
No,
you'll never look at it the same way after writing this book.
Yeah,
So, yeah.
For sure. And another kind of like book question I had is, and the other thing too, I guess the other thing about like survival stories that I find really compelling is the way, like Alive is a book I've given to people who are kind of going through some stuff.
Yes.
And
yes.
And again, and this has come up on this podcast before, but I did a screenwriting course in college where somebody said, like, Good Will Hunting isn't a movie about what it's like to be a math genius. It's a movie about what it's like to be human and vulnerable.
I
And
totally agree. His math genius is the avenue to him getting help. And it was what catalyzed that conversation of him connecting with someone else who had a different kind of trauma. And it was I totally agree. It was about him connecting with somebody else who had different trauma, but was on the other side of it. And therefore they could commiserate over that. Yeah, totally.
and
Um,
and I guess to that point, the number of people who are going to need the practical lessons of what to do when you like crash in the Andes is vanishingly small. But everybody's going to go through something where they need to where they need to understand that they might have more in them than they thought they did, or
yeah.
that maybe now is not the time to give up just yet. And maybe to the point of into thin air, right? Like there are going to be situations where you're led into a situation you don't want to be in because of somebody else's like arrogance or bad planning or whatever.
Yeah.
And knowing what that maybe looks like or what
Yeah.
have
And
you.
I think there's a different mentality that people it becomes almost like we were talking about where in these survival scenarios, the resources your brain physically has and your neurobiology changes. I think something about your philosophy of life changes when you have faced your own mortality. And I've never been in like an alive scenario or something like that, obviously, because I would have written that book. But I would have written a book about it. Because I do find it helpful to write things to process. Sometimes I keep them private, but it, when I had my experience where I was really sick in grad school and I moved to an island in California, like that for me was it was a major medical event. Like I was big sick at that time and it took over a year and a half to get a diagnosis. So I genuinely thought in that time period that I was dying and that I would be dead by 25. And so over that year and a half, I really had that transition of coming to terms with my mortality, of watching my body fail in these various ways. It ended up being one of the dumbest stories ever. It ended up being totally harmless, and they gave me a medication, and the medication sucked to be on, but it did help me like start clawing my way back out of it. And I was like, oh, this great. So it was a happy ending. I am fine, but like,
I
yeah, but at that time, I did not know that. And so that was my experience where I kind of relate to this. And it was my moment where I found out what my priorities were. And I found out my priorities were, first of all, my personal hyperfixation, doing what I'd always wanted to do, going on these final adventures, and also just like being kind to other people. Like I spent a lot of time during that time period just trying to do things for other people that they couldn't do for themselves. And like that was my survival technique. So now I know that these are my mental coping mechanisms in times of stress, in times of high stress. Yeah. So along that line, there's another book that's more along that same theme. It's called You Shall Know Our Velocity by Dave Eggers. And
oh
he's a very famous writer, but like this is one of his less popular books. And I think the reason for that is because my relation to it was as someone who had been through a massive trauma. Like this book is about a person struggling to consume as much life as possible after surviving a massive trauma. And so I've given this to people who are going through those kinds of things too, and gotten the same response, where it's like a completely different way to experience that type of event, right? Like medical versus survival. But yeah, I totally agree with you. Changes yeah.
Yeah, and there's no one, and that's the thing too. I always give that caveat because I know some people where they probably would get a lot out of reading like a survival story, but they might think it's some macho like man versus mountain, whatever. But if you
Depends
pay,
on how it's written. Yeah, it depends
yeah,
on how it's
yeah,
written.
and I think,
Yeah. So
and with some of these stories, if you pay attention to the way people experience getting through, I mean, there are people where they were injured. They were not about to contribute in a physical way to their own survival, but they were like taking care of the person next to them or whatever,
yeah, like
or they were
they were
funny or
like they
like,
were on the kayak doing what they could, right? They had their job. So it gave them purpose. So yeah,
a-
just like you said.
and even like
Well,
going out and having adventures or diving or whatever, it's like it's never the person who's really fun to do that with is not it's not what you think. It's not Rambo. It's someone who's like
yeah, I
kind of
hate going out with Rambo.
no, it's like
Yeah,
easygoing and
yeah.
what was it?
Not gonna freak out, low key. Yeah, I totally agree. Yeah, so my dive buddies are all the ones who are gonna just have huh, well, how are we gonna handle that when something breaks or when there's an emergency? Like that's the mentality that I want from you. So yeah.
Is there a book? I got this question from someone else who's going to be coming on the podcast soon, and I'm not sure what order these are going to come out in. But is there a book that you're not going to write, but you wish someone would write on a topic that you're interested in? Or
That's a really good question. I would love a first person account of the experience of TBI and PTSD. And I think that a military veteran would be the person to write that, because one of the big rules of TBI is that the person who experiences that neurotrauma doesn't necessarily have the cognitive capacity to process that they have experienced the neurotrauma at that time. So almost universally, when those events happen, people think they're okay. When I talk about evaluating TBI, like if I'm teaching this, my number one rule is treat them like your slightly drunk friend. So your slightly drunk friend always thinks they can drive, right? Your friend who's just experienced a possible TBI event thinks they're fine. So and that's not their fault. That's just the brain. That's how the brain works. And I would really love someone's story from event through the diagnostic process of what that's like, because that is a longer journey than most people understand, as well as dealing with separating out potential PTSD aspects and hopefully with the resolution of them finding peace for themselves and finding a life functionality that works for them at the end. I would read the hell out of that.
yeah, I would too. That sounds really good.
Yeah,
I
but I'm not the one for that. So.
Oh man, yeah, that sounds like a good one. Anyway, if someone's out there and they're listening,
yeah,
they-
we got a
and
ghostwriter here. We got a ghostwriter,
right? Yes, I always save any questions about ongoing projects for last because everybody varies. Some people that's top secret and they don't want to go there. But what are you working on now? If you're happy to.
I'm happy to discuss. I'm not going to give a last name, because honestly, the book deal isn't final yet, or I'm still in the proposal stage. But if anyone can scoop me at this point, you've earned it, because the amount of research I put into this is massive.
Proposals are harder than books to write for people listening at home.
Yeah,
it's
totally
it's
agree.
a nightmare.
You start with a proposal, and you gotta have all the research or a lot of the research done. So I've got a solid outline. I'm working on my sample chapter. But I think that I have found the first woman ever to be a special agent in the United States on behalf of the federal government. Her name is Emma. She would have been active during World War I. And the reason I think she's first is because I've also found some very suggestive evidence that J. Edgar Hoover willfully destroyed all of the records of all the female agents. So I can't prove she was first. I know she was doing this stuff. But there might have been others before her that I just haven't found. But she was doing some pretty badass stuff, taking down a German spy ring. And that spy ring, I do think, this is my teaser, I do think they were linked to the Lusitania as well. So I found some cool documents that I've never seen in any nautical histories before that I will share with you privately, but not over.
Oh, amazing.
Not
amazing.
over. But yeah, so this is her story of how she worked with as a special agent doing that stuff. So in that case file, she was awesome. She was so cool.
Oh, that sounds really cool.
Yeah.
Yeah. Wow. Oh, amazing. Well, like so many questions off the record at some point.
They needed her because they needed a woman to infiltrate certain aspects of the spy ring, because there were female spies. And so they needed her as a female agent because she was also fluent in multiple languages. I'm not sure how many the estimates vary. It was a minimum of 4, but possibly 11. So
Wow.
yeah.
Oh, this sounds cool. And
Yeah,
I
it'd
mean
be
that,
cool. I'm
and
excited about it.
that
Not
has,
glistening, man.
oh man, that
Yeah.
has like that has like limited series written all over it too. Um,
I'm really hopeful someone will make Chamber Divers into a movie at some point, but we'll see.
oh, I think
I think
awesome so far.
there's some scouting and some beach scene stuff that I think is pretty great.
Yeah, at
and
the very
deserves some
least, you'll get to go be on location in France, hopefully.
I just want the story to be known, but yeah, that I would not say no to that. But yeah, I just think it's a story where some really amazing people deserve some credit. So.
And
Yeah.
real quick, just at the risk of going down another rabbit hole, but I mean, I love to try to cover every aspect of professional storytelling. And we recorded a short episode about query letters, and I think we're going to have a follow-up about proposals.
Okay.
So let me know what you think of this description. Like this, just based on the last 6 months of my life with this this book that we finally sold and we're at work. The process, it's almost as if someone's asking you, like, write a scale model of a book.
Yes.
But,
Yeah.
but
That's
like,
it. You're writing your own cliff notes before you've written the book.
and
Yeah.
then like, and sometimes, because you do hear people like my wife writes fiction, and there's like a sanctity of like, do not talk about something that's not finished. But with a proposal, you're already doing that anyway.
Yeah.
But the thing is that's so weird about it, you're writing like this miniature book, but then you're also like having to justify its existence in writing the entire time with your marketing section.
Sell it.
And
yeah, it's a little bit weird because the product doesn't exist yet. So you have to sell someone a product that doesn't exist yet. It honestly, to me, it feels exactly like being a scientist. When I write grant proposals, it's pretty much the exact same experience. I have to include sections about how many people will care about this science and how many people it will impact. So, and similar science, that's sort of similar, but different enough that you should fund me. And that's the same thing as like listing comparable titles. So it feels really similar.
And yeah, any advice for someone who, because I mean, like, I'm your audience for these submarine books. So like, you had me at Civil War submarine.
You were easy.
Right. But like, how do you go to a publisher with something that, like, and I mean this as a compliment, sounds commercially unpromising, like Civil War submarines. How do you go to them and be like, no, this really is worth publishing?
So I think, first of all, my foot in the door with publishing was finding the story that only I could tell. So the first one about the H.L. Henley, only I could tell that story from the perspective of talking about the blast and the blast trauma. So that was my foot in the door, and I did not know what I was doing. But because I was the only person who could tell that story, they wanted it, and they were willing to teach me the rest. So my agent and my editor were spectacular in helping me through that. So that's my number one piece of advice, is in getting that kind of started. And then the second advice is you do have to figure out why people will care about it. So it might be a story that's interesting to you personally, but it is also a business. Like, that's just the reality. And people are busy and people are selective with what they buy because they need something that will already have a chance of touching them as a person. So a book where you're selling it just as, this guy was pretty interesting to me, it's probably not going to sell. You need to figure out why other people care about that person too. You need to figure out why other people care about that story. So a good agent will help you with that. My agent is very helpful for me with that. She and I usually have a conversation about that. But before I even pick a next book, like, I'll give her a couple ideas and she'll be like, yes, this one. So lean on your agent if you have one. If you don't have one, start your materials yourself, do your best, and then get one. Agents are open to blind emails. This is part of their job, finding new talent. But have at least an idea in your head of, this is why I think this will relate to people's lives in a way that will make them want to dedicate the time to the story.
Brilliant. Oh, that's great advice. Cool. Well, Rachel,
I'm just stealing it from my agent and editor.
yeah,
I'm just,
yeah.
like I said, I found the story only I could write, and then I'm just passing it on. Yeah.
Luckily, my agent wrote a book about getting an agent, which we've
That's
recommended on
awesome.
here many times.
Yeah, that's awesome.
Now, the question I always wrap up with, but I feel like we went down like every possible rabbit hole, but like, is there anything that you wanted to talk about that I didn't ask about?
Not particularly, but according to World War II research, which I don't know if there's been subsequent follow-up correcting it, but apparently you can use coconut water as an IV substitute. So there's my survival tip for the day. That may or may not have been corrected by modern science.
And
but
like,
at least in World War II, this was what was happening in the Pacific.
Wow. That's wild. Yeah. Well, yeah. I mean, I would say maybe emphatically, like, don't try this at home, but like,
and survival only. Survival only.
100%. Yeah.
Use them coconuts. Yeah.
Right. Well, Rachel, thanks so much for coming on. That was a lot of fun.
Thank you for having me. I had a great time.
If you have an epic story, I'd love to hear it. You can find me at dailyprose.com or on LinkedIn. My links and Rachel's are in the show notes. Thanks for listening.